The studio lights were bright, and the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. Clint Eastwood was about to appear on one of the most popular talk shows in America. The host, Ryan Matthews, was known for his aggressive political commentary and liberal views, often challenging guests with sharp, confrontational questions. Today, he had invited Clint, the Hollywood legend, to discuss his career and his stance on current events. What Matthews didn't know was that this wasn't going to be just another interview. Clint was tired of the constant political attacks from people like Matthews. The world had changed, and Clint, with decades of experience, had seen enough to know that sometimes silence wasn't the answer. The moment Clint stepped onto the set, the audience erupted into applause, a mix of admiration and curiosity. It was clear that Clint still commanded respect, even among younger generations. Ryan Matthews, standing behind his desk, greeted Clint with a practiced smile, shaking his hand as if everything was perfectly normal. "Clint, it's great to have you on the show. You've been in this business for decades, and your films have made an indelible mark on Hollywood. But today, we're not here to talk about your movies. We're here to talk about politics and your recent comments about the state of the nation." Clint smiled back, a glint of determination in his eyes. He knew where this was going, and he was ready. "Sure, Ryan," Clint said, taking his seat. "Let's talk." Ryan wasted no time, jumping straight into the topic he knew would rattle Clint. "You've been very vocal about the state of politics today. You've said that liberals have lost their way, and that the country is headed in the wrong direction. You've even called for people to stop being so politically correct. But aren't you concerned that this type of rhetoric could divide the country even more?" Clint leaned forward, his voice calm but with the weight of experience behind every word. "Ryan, I'm concerned that people have become too sensitive. We've lost the ability to have real conversations. Instead, everyone is so quick to label others. If you disagree with someone, they call you a racist, a misogynist, a fascist. That's not how a real democracy works." Ryan's eyes narrowed, and he could feel the tension building. He had anticipated this answer, but he wasn't ready for how Clint would push back. "But Clint," Ryan countered, his voice a little sharper, "people are just trying to create a fair and inclusive society. We can't just go around insulting people and pretending it's all okay." Clint held up his hand, stopping Ryan mid-sentence. "I'm not insulting anyone. What I'm saying is that we've lost sight of the importance of debate and open discussion. People are too quick to shut down conversations because they're afraid of offending someone. We need to be able to disagree without hurling insults. We need to get back to real conversations." The crowd in the studio was silent now, the intensity of Clint's words cutting through the tension. Ryan Matthews, visibly taken aback, tried to recover, his mind racing to find a way to regain control. "But Clint," Ryan pressed, "you've been known for making controversial statements in the past, and some people argue that your views are outdated. Is it possible that your opinions are more aligned with the past, with a time when things were much simpler but not necessarily better?" Clint chuckled softly, his smile almost imperceptible. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment when he could make his stance clear. He sat back in his chair, his voice steady, his eyes never leaving Ryan's. "Look, Ryan," Clint said, his tone unwavering, "I've lived through some of the most turbulent times in American history. I've seen this country go through wars, economic crashes, and civil rights movements. I know what it means to stand for something, to fight for something. But what I don't know is when it became wrong to have a differing opinion, to stand up for what you believe in without being called every name in the book." Ryan opened his mouth to speak, but Clint didn't let him. "The problem is not that people like me are holding on to the past. The problem is that we've lost our ability to think for ourselves, to understand that differing opinions don't make you the enemy. I'm not stuck in the past, but I am fighting to bring back the respect we used to have for each other's views." The studio was completely silent now, the weight of Clint's words settling over everyone. Ryan Matthews, the liberal host known for his cutting remarks, was suddenly speechless. Clint Eastwood had done what few others could do. He had not just pushed back, he had obliterated the narrative. He wasn't here to be intimidated by political correctness or to be a pawn in someone else's ideological game. He was here to speak his truth, and the truth was powerful. Ryan Matthews stood there, his mouth slightly open, unable to respond immediately. The words Clint Eastwood had just spoken were not the ones he had prepared for. They weren't the deflections or dodging he expected from celebrities trying to stay in the good graces of the public. Clint had laid it all out. Blunt, straightforward, and without apology. The studio audience was silent, still absorbing the weight of Clint's message. Ryan fumbled with his papers, his confidence shaken for the first time in years. Clint had not just deflected the attack, he had completely taken control of the conversation, shifting the narrative from politics to a much more fundamental issue: respect, understanding, and the importance of free speech. Ryan cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. Mr. Eastwood, with all due respect, you're saying that the solution is just to go back to the way things were? You think we should return to a time where certain groups were systematically oppressed, where the voices of women, minorities, and marginalized communities were ignored? Clint's face didn't change. He wasn't about to let Ryan bait him into a corner. No, Ryan, I'm saying we need to stop living in the past. I'm saying we need to look at history to learn, not to stay stuck in it. We need to find common ground in our differences, not just point fingers and label people we disagree with. Ryan's eyebrows furrowed as he tried to argue back, but Clint continued, his voice unwavering. I'm not talking about going back to some golden age. I'm talking about the ability to have a real conversation, to listen, to agree or disagree without burning bridges, without attacking someone personally for having a different perspective. You can't have a functioning society if we're too afraid to speak the truth. Ryan opened his mouth again, but the words didn't come out immediately. The host, who had been known for his sharp, sarcastic interviews, now seemed oddly vulnerable. He wasn't prepared for this level of honesty, and for the first time, the audience could see him struggling. This wasn't the well-rehearsed, predictable political debate. This was a clash of ideologies, and Clint Eastwood wasn't backing down. We have to be able to disagree, Ryan, without the name-calling, the insults, the pushing of a right or wrong narrative. We're all Americans, and we have a responsibility to listen, not just shout louder than the other guy. Ryan Matthews, now visibly taken aback, paused for a moment. The sharpness in his eyes had softened. He leaned forward slightly, almost as if he were weighing Clint's words. The audience could feel the shift in energy. It wasn't just an interview anymore. It had turned into a test of ideals, a battle of moral convictions. Clint leaned back in his chair, his calm demeanor still intact, but his words were as sharp as ever. You can disagree with me all you want, Ryan, but I'm not going to sit here and let you paint me as part of the problem just because I don't toe the liberal line. I've spent my life making films that challenge people's thinking, that show the complexity of human nature, and I've made mistakes, but I've always been willing to learn from them. Ryan paused, finally taking a breath. His posture softened, and for a brief moment, Clint saw the first signs of respect in his eyes. It was clear that Ryan Matthews, a man known for his polarizing opinions, had just been forced to reconsider everything he had assumed about Clint Eastwood. What you're saying makes sense, Clint, but it's hard for some people to hear when the conversation is so charged. The country is so divided right now. What do you think we can do to fix it? Clint's expression didn't change, but there was a subtle glint in his eyes. You start by talking to each other, and when the conversation gets heated, don't walk away. Don't just label people based on their views. try to see things from their perspective. We're not enemies, Ryan. We're just people trying to make sense of a complicated world. For a moment, the studio was still, the weight of Clint's message hanging in the air. Ryan Matthews had no immediate rebuttal. The conversation had taken an unexpected turn, and the audience, who had been prepared for a typical debate, now seemed to be reflecting on something deeper, more personal. Finally, Ryan spoke, his voice more measured. I didn't expect that, Clint. I've got to admit, I came in here thinking this was going to be a typical interview, but you've given me a lot to think about. Clint gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. That's the point, Ryan. If we start thinking for ourselves again, we might actually find a way to work through all this. The interview was over, but it had changed everything. Clint Eastwood had not just taken down a liberal host. He had redefined the conversation. The studio audience sat in stunned silence, the air still thick with the implications of what had just happened. And as Clint Eastwood stood to leave, he did so with the quiet confidence of someone who knew that sometimes the most powerful weapon you have is the truth, spoken calmly and without fear. Clint Eastwood stood, his movements deliberate and unhurried, as the studio audience remained silent. The confrontation had left them stunned, the atmosphere in the room thick with the weight of what had just transpired. For the first time in a long while, Ryan Matthews seemed to have lost control of the conversation, and the truth had made its way to the surface. Unfiltered, undeniable. As Clint made his way toward the exit, he could feel the gaze of every person in the room following him. Some were in awe, others in shock, but all were undoubtedly reconsidering their own perspectives on what had just occurred. Clint had done more than speak his mind. He had turned the tables, forcing everyone to confront the reality of the political and social divide that was growing wider every day. He wasn't just a Hollywood icon. He was a man who stood firm in his beliefs and wasn't afraid to challenge the status quo. Ryan Matthews sat at his desk, staring after Clint, his expression unreadable. It was clear that he was trying to gather his thoughts, his usual biting commentary now absent. For the first time in the interview, Ryan looked vulnerable, a position he had rarely found himself in. He had expected to take Clint down, to expose him as out of touch or out of step with the modern world, but Clint had flipped the script. Ryan Matthews was left questioning his own convictions. The camera continued to roll, but Ryan, usually quick with a quip or retort, remained silent. It took a moment before he regained his composure, turning to face the audience with a slight shake of his head. Well, he began, his voice a little softer than usual. That was a lot to unpack. Clint Eastwood doesn't back down, does he? A few nervous chuckles filled the room, but the energy had shifted. Ryan's usual fiery demeanor had been tempered, replaced by a sense of genuine reflection. And you know, Ryan continued, maybe we should all take a second to think about what Clint said. Maybe we've all been so caught up in shouting over each other that we've forgotten how to listen. It was a rare admission, one that the audience could feel was sincere. Ryan Matthews, the liberal host who had built a career on challenging his guests, had just been forced to listen. And in doing so, he had realized something that many people, on both sides of the aisle, were too quick to dismiss. The power of civil discourse, the importance of hearing each other out, no matter how difficult the conversation might be. As Clint walked off the set, he felt a quiet sense of victory, but not the kind that came from winning a fight. This wasn't about defeating Ryan Matthews or proving that he was right. It was about sowing the seeds for something greater, a reminder that in a world filled with noise and division, the real strength lies in speaking with clarity, understanding, and respect. Outside the studio, Clint stepped into the cool evening air. His phone buzzed in his pocket, but he ignored it for a moment, taking a deep breath and enjoying the simplicity of the moment. The battle wasn't over, but he had won this round. He had made his point clear, and he had done so with the kind of strength that only comes from standing up for what's right. As Clint walked away from the studio, he knew that the conversation wasn't finished. Ryan Matthews, the audience, and everyone who had been watching, they were all left to grapple with the questions Clint had raised. And perhaps, just maybe, it would be the beginning of a change in the way we communicate with each other, across political lines, across ideologies, across everything that had divided us for so long. And in the quiet of that moment, Clint Eastwood knew one thing for certain. The truth, no matter how uncomfortable or inconvenient, was always worth fighting for. If Clint's powerful stand for the truth inspired you, don't forget to subscribe for more stories of courage, honesty, and standing tall in the face of adversity.